You have 10 minutes to leave, or this property becomes ours. I still remember the way those words echoed across my driveway that morning, carried by the cold wind and the low hum of a white SUV parked where my grandfather's old pickup used to sit. I was standing there holding a folder of documents in my hand, the edges worn from years of careful storage, while the HOA president smiled like she had already won. What she didn't know was that every page inside that folder was about to change everything. My name is Daniel Whitmore, and 3 years ago I thought I had finally found the quiet life I always wanted. After spending most of my career as a construction estimator, I bought a small ranch-style home outside of Austin, Texas. It sat on 2.5 acres at the edge of a growing neighborhood called Cedar Ridge Estates. The place was nothing fancy. The porch boards were old, the driveway was gravel, and the backyard still had the oak tree my grandfather planted decades earlier. But every morning, I could hear birds instead of traffic. I could smell fresh-cut grass instead of exhaust. For the first time in years, I felt like I had a place that truly belonged to me. The deed had been in my family for over 30 years before I purchased it. My father taught me something simple when I was young. Always know what you own, and always keep your paperwork. I never realized how important that lesson would become. The trouble started with Evelyn Carter, the president of the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA. Evelyn was the kind of person who treated neighborhood rules like they were federal laws. She drove a spotless black Cadillac, carried a clipboard everywhere, and somehow knew when someone's trash bin was left outside 5 minutes too long. At first, I ignored the small complaints. A note about my fence color, a reminder about my mailbox, a warning about my landscaping. I fixed what made sense and politely questioned what didn't. But Evelyn wasn't interested in compromise. She wanted control. One Tuesday morning, I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery outside my property line. The sharp beep of a construction vehicle backing up cut through the quiet air. The smell of fresh asphalt filled my driveway before I even opened the front door. When I stepped outside, I saw workers installing a new entrance sign beside my private access road. The sign read Cedar Ridge Estates Community Access. My stomach dropped. That road wasn't community property. I had bought it separately. I walked toward the crew, and the foreman handed me a document with an HOA letterhead at the top. According to Evelyn, the road was now considered a neighborhood improvement project, and I was expected to cooperate. Then she appeared, walking slowly across the pavement with that same confident smile. "Daniel, don't make this difficult," she said. "We're simply correcting an oversight." An oversight. That was the word she used for taking control of something my family had protected for decades. I looked down at the fresh asphalt covering the gravel path my grandfather built with his own hands, and I realized something. Evelyn wasn't asking for permission. She believed she already had it. But she had no idea that the same paperwork she ignored was the one thing standing between her and a mistake she could never undo. The first thing I did was walk back inside and close the door. Not because I was giving up, but because I knew something Evelyn Carter did not understand. The loudest person in the room is rarely the person with the strongest position. I placed the document on my kitchen table, poured myself a cup of coffee, and opened the filing cabinet where my family history had been sitting for years. The smell of old paper and fresh coffee filled the room as I started going through everything my father and grandfather had saved. Property records, survey maps, tax documents, maintenance receipts. Every piece of paper told a small part of the story. My grandfather, Thomas Whitmore, was not a wealthy man. He worked with his hands, built things carefully, and believed that owning something meant taking responsibility for it. I still remembered sitting beside him on that gravel road when I was a kid, watching him repair fence posts under the Texas sun. He always carried the same leather notebook in his truck. Inside were measurements, dates, and notes about every improvement he made. Back then, I thought it was just an old habit. Years later, I realized it was preparation. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The building smelled like dust, printer paper, and old carpet. I sat at a small desk under fluorescent lights and started searching through the property records connected to my land. Hours passed. My coffee went cold. My eyes grew tired from reading legal descriptions and survey details. Then I found something that made me stop. The access road was not just listed separately. It had a recorded easement history that went back decades before Cedar Ridge Estates was even built. The road was part of my property agreement, protected by documents signed by previous owners and recorded with the county. I leaned back in my chair and read the information again slowly. The homeowners association had not discovered an oversight. They had ignored a boundary they should have known existed. But I was not ready to celebrate yet. I knew people like Evelyn did not act without confidence. Nobody walks onto another person's property and starts a construction project unless they believe something is protecting them. That question stayed in my mind all afternoon. Who told her she could do this? When I returned home, another envelope was waiting on my porch. The paper was thick. The logo at the top was perfectly printed. Inside was a notice from the Cedar Ridge Estates Homeowners Association claiming I had violated community access regulations. They demanded that I allow permanent use of my road and pay a monthly maintenance fee. I read the letter twice. Then I noticed something else. The signature at the bottom was Evelyn Carter's. Not a lawyer, not a county official, just Evelyn. She had signed her name like it was enough to make a rule become a law. I folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the old survey documents on my table. That was the moment I stopped seeing this as a disagreement with a neighbor. This was a battle of paperwork, patience, and proof. Evelyn believed she had power because people usually backed down when they saw official-looking letters. But she did not know that I had spent my entire career reading plans, contracts, and details most people ignored. And the smallest details were usually where the truth was hiding. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint sound of wind moving through the oak tree outside my window. I stood there holding my coffee, looking through the glass at the road my family had protected for decades. It looked the same, but it felt different. A place that once represented peace now felt like the center of a fight I never asked for. I knew I needed to understand exactly who I was dealing with. So I started digging into Cedar Ridge Estates and the person who seemed determined to control every inch of it. Evelyn Carter had been the HOA president for almost 5 years. According to public records, she was a successful real estate consultant who built her reputation around creating what she called perfect communities. But after speaking with a few neighbors, I started hearing a different version of the story. I visited my neighbor, Frank Miller, who lived 3 houses down. He was a retired teacher who had watched the neighborhood change from open fields into rows of identical homes. We sat on his front porch while the smell of fresh brewed coffee drifted through the morning air. "Daniel, you are not the first person she has pressured," he told me. He pulled out a folder from inside his house. Inside were copies of letters, notices, and complaints he had received over the years. A mailbox color issue, a garden decoration complaint, a warning about a shed that had already been approved by the county. None of the problems were serious, but the pattern was obvious. Evelyn used paperwork to wear people down. She knew most residents did not have the time or energy to challenge every notice. She counted on people choosing peace over conflict. That strategy worked for a long time, until she met someone who actually read the documents. Later that afternoon, I attended a Cedar Ridge Estates HOA meeting. I wanted to hear Evelyn explain herself in front of the community. The clubhouse smelled like fresh paint and expensive air freshener. Rows of chairs filled the room, and neighbors sat quietly, watching the front table where Evelyn placed her folders. She looked completely comfortable. When she saw me walk in, she smiled. "Daniel, I am glad you decided to cooperate," she said. I sat down and listened. For nearly 20 minutes, she explained how the road project was necessary for the future of the neighborhood. She used words like improvement, safety, and community benefit. But every time someone asked a question about ownership, she changed the subject. Then I raised my hand. "Can you show everyone the document that gives the HOA authority over my private road?" The room became silent. Evelyn paused for just a second. It was small, but I noticed it. She reached for a folder and said the matter was complicated and would be handled by the HOA attorney. That answer told me everything. She did not have what she claimed to have. On the drive home, the evening sun reflected off the new asphalt they had placed near my property line. I could still smell the fresh pavement through my open window. I looked at that road and realized Evelyn had made one mistake. She thought this was about convincing people. She did not realize I was already collecting facts. And facts have a way of outlasting confidence. The following week changed the way I looked at the entire situation. Until then, I believed Evelyn Carter was simply someone who enjoyed having control. But what I discovered next showed me that this was not just about a road or a neighborhood improvement project. It was about creating a story and convincing everyone to accept it before anyone checked the facts. My first clue came from a simple envelope sitting in my mailbox on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. The paper was thick, the kind of paper companies use when they want something to feel official. Inside was another notice from the Cedar Ridge Estates HOA. This time, the language was more aggressive. They claimed my refusal to cooperate was delaying a community project, and that continued resistance could result in additional fees. I stood there on my front porch, feeling the rough texture of the paper between my fingers while the afternoon breeze moved through the trees behind my house. It was strange. The words looked serious, but something about them felt empty. There was no court document, no county order, no official property ruling, just another letter designed to make me feel smaller. I decided to visit the county planning office. The building was exactly what you would expect from a government office. Gray walls, old filing cabinets, the quiet sound of printers running in the background. I sat across from a records specialist named Sarah Mitchell and explained what was happening. She listened carefully and pulled up the property maps on her computer. The screen glowed with years of recorded information. Then she looked at me and said something I will never forget. "Daniel, this road is clearly shown as separate property." Hearing those words felt like a weight lifting off my shoulders. But I was not surprised. I already knew the truth. What mattered was proving that everyone else could see it too. Sarah helped me locate additional records connected to the original development plans for Cedar Ridge Estates. That was when another important detail appeared. The neighborhood was built years after my family's road rights were already recorded. The developers had known about the boundary. The HOA should have known too. When I returned home that evening, I found Evelyn standing near the entrance of my driveway. She was holding her clipboard like always. The sunset reflected off her vehicle, and the smell of freshly watered lawns filled the air around us. "Daniel, I heard you have been asking questions," she said. Her voice was calm, but there was a warning underneath it. "I have been looking for answers," I replied. She smiled slightly. "Sometimes people make things harder than they need to be." That sentence stayed with me, because I realized Evelyn was used to people backing down before reaching the truth. She was used to the first letter being the final answer. But I had spent years working with contracts and construction plans. I knew something she did not. Every project has a foundation. If the foundation is wrong, everything built on top of it eventually falls apart. That night, I opened my grandfather's old notebook again. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages smelled like time itself. Near the back, I found a handwritten note about the road. A small sentence written decades earlier. "Keep the records. Someday someone may try to claim what is not theirs." I read those words twice. Then I closed the notebook and looked out at the road. Evelyn thought she was creating a problem for me. She did not realize she had just uncovered the evidence I needed. The next few days were quieter than I expected, but I knew better than to mistake silence for surrender. People like Evelyn Carter rarely stopped because they were wrong. They stopped because they were planning their next move. Every morning, I checked my mailbox expecting another notice, another letter, another attempt to make me question something I already knew was true. Then on Friday afternoon, it arrived. This time it was different. The envelope was not from the HOA office. It came from a law firm. I stood on my porch holding it while the Texas sun warmed the wooden boards beneath my feet. The smell of dry grass and cedar filled the air, but my attention was locked on that envelope. I opened it slowly. Inside was a formal demand stating that I needed to provide access to the road for community purposes or face possible legal action. I read the letter carefully from beginning to end. The words were professional. The tone was serious. But once again, there was something missing. Proof. They were asking me to give up a property right without showing they had any authority to take it. I placed the letter beside my grandfather's notebook and started building my response. I did not want to fight. I wanted facts. I created a timeline of everything that happened. The construction equipment arriving. The new signs being installed. The HOA notices. The meeting where Evelyn avoided answering a simple question. Every date, every document, every conversation went into one organized folder. Years of working in construction taught me something important. Details matter. A small measurement error can ruin an entire project. A missing signature can change a contract. A single sentence can decide who has the right to build and who does not. That weekend, I spoke with an attorney named Robert Hayes who specialized in property disputes. His office was small, with shelves full of legal books and a desk covered with carefully organized files. He reviewed everything I brought in. The maps, the notices, The county records. After nearly an hour, he leaned back and said, "Daniel, the paperwork is on your side. But you need to understand something. The HOA has been counting on people not looking closely." That sentence explained everything. Evelyn's strength was never the law. Her strength was confidence. She acted like authority belonged to whoever spoke the loudest. On Monday morning, I received another surprise. A neighbor named Frank Miller called me and asked if he could stop by. When he arrived, he brought a stack of old HOA meeting notes. He told me he had kept copies because he noticed a pattern over the years. We sat at my kitchen table while the pages spread across the wood surface. The smell of old paper filled the room. The notes showed multiple discussions about expanding HOA influence beyond the original neighborhood boundaries. There were conversations about future access control and community expansion opportunities. Nothing directly mentioned my property, but the intention was becoming clear. Evelyn was not trying to solve a problem. She was trying to create a new reality and convince everyone it had always existed. That evening, I walked outside and stood beside the old oak tree my grandfather planted. The branches moved gently above me, and I could hear the quiet sound of wind passing through the leaves. I thought about how many years that tree had watched over this land. Generations came and went, but the records remained. The truth remained, and I finally understood the game Evelyn was playing. She was hoping I would react emotionally. She wanted frustration. She wanted anger. She wanted me to make a mistake. Instead, I did the one thing she never expected. I stayed patient. Because when someone builds their entire argument on assumptions, all you need is time for reality to catch up. The following Monday morning, I walked into Robert Hayes's office, carrying the same folder I had been building for weeks. It was heavier now, not because the paper weighed more, but because every page represented another piece of the truth. The quiet hum of the office lights filled the room as Robert spread the documents across his desk. He moved slowly, carefully, reading every line like he was putting together a puzzle. I watched his eyes stop on certain pages, especially the property records and the old development maps. Then he reached for a yellow folder sitting on the corner of his desk. "Daniel, I want you to see something," he said. Inside was a copy of the original Cedar Ridge Estates development plan from years earlier. The paper was faded, the ink slightly worn, but the information was clear. The original developers had marked my private road separately from the neighborhood infrastructure. It was never intended to become a community road. It was never owned by the HOA. It was never available for expansion. I felt a strange calm come over me. Not excitement, not anger, just certainty. The answer had been there the entire time. Evelyn had built her entire argument around people not checking the details. But details were exactly where I lived. Robert pointed to a section near the bottom of the document. There was a note from the county approving the original layout. A small line that most people would ignore. It confirmed that any future changes affecting private access areas required approval from the property owner. My property. The person Evelyn never asked. On the drive home, I kept thinking about how different this situation looked from the outside. To most people, it probably seemed like a simple disagreement between a homeowner and an HOA. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. This was about assumptions. Evelyn assumed a letterhead could replace a legal document. She assumed confidence could replace proof. She assumed nobody would challenge her. That evening, I found another envelope waiting by my front door. This time, it was from Evelyn herself. Inside was an invitation to a special HOA meeting. The wording was polite, almost friendly. But I knew better. It was another attempt to control the conversation. She wanted the neighborhood to see her as the reasonable person trying to find a solution. I decided to attend, not because I believed she would change her mind, but because I wanted everyone to hear the facts. The meeting room was crowded when I arrived. Neighbors filled the chairs, whispering quietly as they waited. Evelyn stood at the front wearing the same confident expression I had seen from the beginning. She thanked everyone for coming and started explaining how the road project was important for the future of the community. She talked about growth, convenience, and property values. Then she looked directly at me. "Daniel has some concerns about the project," she said. Concerns. That was an interesting word for someone defending ownership rights. When it was my turn to speak, I placed my folder on the table. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I simply opened the documents one by one. The room became quiet as neighbors passed around copies of the original maps. People who had only heard Evelyn's version were finally seeing the information for themselves. I noticed her expression change slightly. It was not panic. It was something else. Realization. For the first time, she understood that this was no longer a private conversation she could control. The truth was now sitting in front of everyone. And the most powerful thing about the truth is that it does not need permission to be heard. The silence after that meeting was different. It was not the uncomfortable silence I had felt before when Evelyn Carter walked into a room and everyone avoided eye contact. This time, people were thinking. They were looking at the documents, comparing the dates, and asking questions that had never been asked before. For years, Evelyn had controlled the conversation because she controlled the information. But once the facts were on the table, that control started slipping away. The next morning, my phone started ringing. One neighbor after another called to tell me they had experienced similar situations. Small notices, unexpected fees, rules that seemed to change depending on who was being affected. I sat at my kitchen table with my coffee, getting cold beside me, listening to stories that sounded strangely familiar. The pattern was becoming clear. Evelyn did not just want a road. She wanted the ability to decide what belonged to the community and what belonged to individuals. That was the part that bothered me the most. Property was not just land. It was responsibility, history, and trust. I knew I had to be careful with my next move. Winning an argument was not enough. I needed a solution that could stand on paper and survive after the attention faded. Robert and I started preparing a formal response. We gathered the original property records, county approvals, development plans, and every communication from the HOA. Each document had a purpose. Each page connected another piece of the timeline. While we worked, Evelyn made one final attempt to control the situation. She sent another letter to the neighborhood claiming that misinformation was spreading and that the HOA was simply protecting community interests. It was carefully written. Every sentence sounded reasonable, but there was one problem. It avoided the one question everyone wanted answered. Where was the legal authority to use my road? That question became impossible to ignore. A few days later, Cedar Ridge Estates held another community meeting. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. The room was not filled with quiet agreement. People were asking direct questions. One homeowner asked why the HOA never presented the original property records. Another asked why construction started before permission was received. Evelyn tried to redirect the conversation, but the room had changed. For the first time, she was no longer speaking to people who only knew her version of events. She was speaking to people who had seen the evidence. I watched carefully as she shuffled through her papers. The confident smile was still there, but it looked different now. It looked like someone trying to hold on to an idea that was already falling apart. Then Robert stood and explained the legal situation clearly. No accusations. No dramatic statements. Just facts. The private road belonged to me. The HOA had no recorded authority to claim ownership or impose fees. The construction project had moved forward without the proper permission. The room went quiet. Outside, I could hear the wind moving through the trees near my property line. It reminded me of my grandfather's old notebook and the lesson he left behind. Keep the records. Protect what is yours. That night, I drove home knowing the hardest part was behind me. But I also knew something else. Evelyn had spent years building a system based on people staying silent. Now she had to face the one thing she never planned for. Someone willing to speak with proof. The morning after the meeting, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was quiet, but my mind was already moving through every detail of what happened the night before. The sunlight came through the kitchen window, shining across the papers still sitting on my table. The same documents that Evelyn Carter thought would never see the light of day were now the reason everyone in Cedar Ridge Estates was asking questions. I made my coffee, opened the folder, and started organizing everything one more time. I knew the truth was on my side, but I also knew something important. A victory is not just about proving someone wrong. It is about making sure the same mistake cannot happen again. Robert and I prepared the final paperwork. The goal was simple. Protect the property rights, correct the official records, and make sure the boundaries were clearly understood by everyone. There was no need for dramatic arguments. The documents spoke for themselves. A few days later, we received confirmation from the county office that the property records had been reviewed. The private access road remained exactly what it had always been. Private. The construction signs near my property line had to be removed, and the HOA could no longer present the road as community property. When I heard that news, I walked outside and stood near the old oak tree in my backyard. The air smelled like dry earth and fresh grass after the morning watering. For the first time in weeks, the property felt peaceful again. But the story was not completely finished. Evelyn still had one more meeting scheduled with the HOA board. This time, she was not presenting a plan. She was answering questions. I attended because I wanted to see how everything would be handled. The clubhouse felt different when I walked in. The confidence that used to fill the room was gone. Neighbors who once stayed quiet were now speaking openly. They asked about the decisions that had been made without proper review. They asked why assumptions were treated like facts. They asked why homeowners were pressured before the information was verified. Evelyn sat at the front table with her folders stacked neatly in front of her. The same folders she once used to make everyone feel like they had no choice. But now those papers were just papers. They were no longer symbols of authority. They were simply documents that needed to be questioned. When the board reviewed the situation, the conclusion was clear. The road project had moved forward without proper authorization, and the HOA procedures needed to be reviewed. Several board members admitted that they had trusted Evelyn's explanation without seeing the full records. That was the part that mattered most to me. The problem was not just one person. The problem was what happens when people stop asking questions. After the meeting ended, Frank Miller walked over and shook my hand. He smiled and said, "Your grandfather would be proud." Those words meant more to me than any official decision. Because this was never just about a road. It was about respecting what people work their entire lives to build. As I drove home that evening, the gravel beneath my tires made the same familiar sound it always had. The difference was that this time, I knew it would stay that way. Some people believe power comes from making others afraid to challenge them. But I learned something from this experience. Real strength comes from knowing the truth, keeping the records, and having the patience to let the facts speak for themselves. A few months passed after the final HOA meeting, but I still found myself walking outside sometimes and looking at that road. It was the same gravel path I had driven on hundreds of times before. The same path where my grandfather taught me how to repair fences, measure distances, and respect the land beneath my feet. The difference was that now, every time I looked at it, I remembered the lesson hidden inside the entire experience. Ownership is not just about having your name on a document. It is about protecting what those documents represent. Cedar Ridge Estates slowly returned to normal. The new signs near my property line were removed. The construction equipment disappeared. The conversations that once filled neighborhood streets gradually changed from frustration to reflection. People who had stayed quiet for years started attending meetings and asking questions. They were not trying to create conflict. They simply wanted to understand the decisions being made around them. That was something I respected. Because the truth was, most people were not trying to cause problems. They just trusted the wrong information. Evelyn Carter eventually stepped away from her role as HOA president. I never celebrated it. I never wanted to embarrass her. My goal was never revenge. My goal was accountability. There is a difference. Anyone can be angry when they feel wronged. But patience, preparation, and facts are what create lasting change. A few weeks later, I received a handwritten note from one of my neighbors. It was from Frank Miller. He thanked me for standing my ground and said something that stayed with me. "You reminded people that being polite does not mean being powerless." I kept that note in the same folder with my grandfather's records. Not because it was proof of anything legal, but because it represented something bigger. It represented the moment when ordinary people remembered they had a voice. Looking back, the most surprising part of the entire situation was not the paperwork or the meetings. It was how easily confidence could look like authority. Evelyn had convinced herself that because she had a title, she had control. But a title without facts is just a label. Real authority comes from responsibility, honesty, and respect for the people affected by your decisions. One evening, I sat on my porch as the sun went down behind the trees. The air carried the smell of fresh grass and the sound of tires moving slowly. Across the gravel reminded me of simpler days. I thought about my grandfather's notebook sitting safely inside my house. Decades earlier, he had written a simple reminder: keep the records. At the time, those words seemed ordinary. Now I understood exactly what he meant. Records protect memories. Records protect effort. Records protect truth. The people who challenge you may have louder voices, bigger titles, or more confidence than you do. But none of that matters when the facts finally arrive. Because in the end, justice does not need to shout. It does not need to threaten. It only needs time, patience, and the truth. And the truth has a way of standing exactly where it belongs.